Get off this plane immediately. The flight attendant's cold words echoed through the cabin as passengers stared at Sarah with suspicious eyes. 9 minutes later, both pilots collapsed unconscious at 30,000 feet, and suddenly, the woman they just kicked off became their only hope for survival. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The afternoon sun blazed through the massive windows of Denver International Airport's Terminal B as Sarah Chin stood in the boarding line for Flight 227 to San Francisco, her worn leather messenger bag slung over one shoulder and her boarding pass clutched in her hand. She was dressed simply in jeans and a faded navy sweatshirt, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, looking like any other tired traveler trying to get home after a long week. The gate agent scanned her pass without incident and she made her way down the jet bridge, feeling the familiar change in air pressure and temperature that always accompanied the transition from terminal to aircraft. As she stepped through the aircraft door, a young flight attendant with perfectly styled blonde hair and a nameplate reading, Jennifer, glanced at her boarding pass and gestured toward the rear of the plane with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Sarah navigated the narrow aisle of the Boeing 737, excusing herself past passengers who were shoving oversized bags into overhead compartments and blocking the way while they settled into their seats. She found her assigned seat in row 23, a middle seat that made her inwardly sigh, but she'd learned long ago not to complain about the small discomforts of commercial travel. She was just lifting her bag to place it in the overhead bin when she heard a sharp voice behind her say, "Excuse me, ma'am, I need to speak with you immediately." Sarah turned to find Jennifer, the flight attendant, standing there with her arms crossed, her expression now openly hostile, and behind her stood a middle-aged couple who were staring at Sarah with obvious displeasure written across their faces. "Is there a problem?" Sarah asked calmly, lowering her bag back down as other passengers began to notice the confrontation and conversations around them started to die down. Jennifer's jaw tightened and she said in a voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Ma'am, I need you to come with me to the front of the aircraft right now. There's been a situation reported and we need to resolve it before we can continue boarding." Sarah felt her stomach drop slightly, but she maintained her composure and asked, "What kind of situation?" "My boarding pass was accepted at the gate and everything with my ticket is in order." Jennifer's eyes flashed with irritation at being questioned and she said even more firmly, "I don't need to explain the details in front of other passengers. Please gather your belongings and come with me immediately. This is not optional." The couple behind Jennifer exchanged knowing glances and the woman said loudly enough for others to hear, "We told you she looked suspicious. I knew there was something wrong the moment I saw her loitering near the gate." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady as she said, "I wasn't loitering anywhere. I was simply waiting to board like everyone else." The husband stepped forward and said, "She was on her phone constantly and kept looking around nervously. My wife has excellent instincts about these things and we reported it to the crew as soon as we saw her behavior." Jennifer held up her hand to silence any further discussion and said, "Ma'am, I'm asking you one final time to come with me voluntarily. If you refuse, I will have to call security to remove you from this aircraft. You're creating a disturbance and delaying our departure." Sarah could see dozens of passengers now watching the scene unfold, some with their phones out recording the confrontation, others whispering to their seatmates about what might be happening. She recognized the expression on their faces because she'd seen it before in her life, that mixture of curiosity and judgment, the assumption that if a crew member was removing someone from a plane there must be a good reason for it. She also knew from years of experience that arguing or causing a scene would only make things worse and potentially escalate the situation into something far more serious. Taking a slow breath, she said quietly, "I'll come with you, but I want you to know that I've done nothing wrong and this is completely unjust." Jennifer's expression didn't soften in the slightest as she said, "Your opinion on the matter has been noted. Now please move toward the front of the aircraft." The walk down the aisle toward the front of the plane felt like it stretched for miles as Sarah moved past rows of staring passengers, some averting their eyes when she looked at them while others openly glared at her with suspicion. She heard someone mutter, "They should have better screening," and another voice said, "I'm glad they caught her before we took off." Each word felt like a small knife, but Sarah kept her head up and her expression neutral, refusing to show how much the unjust accusations hurt. She'd spent too many years maintaining composure in genuinely dangerous situations to let a group of strangers see her break down over their ignorant assumptions. When they reached the front galley area, Jennifer was joined by another flight attendant, an older man named Robert according to his nameplate, and standing just outside the aircraft door was an airport security officer in uniform. "This is the passenger I told you about," Jennifer said to the security officer, her tone suggesting she'd already explained the entire situation. The officer, a stocky man in his 50s with graying hair and a tired expression, looked at Sarah and said, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to exit the aircraft and come with me to discuss the complaints that have been filed against you." Sarah felt a flash of anger break through her calm exterior and she said, "What specific complaints? I have a legal right to know what I'm being accused of. I purchased a ticket, I went through security screening, I boarded the plane with a valid boarding pass. What exactly am I supposed to have done wrong?" The security officer shifted uncomfortably and glanced at Jennifer, who jumped in saying, "You were exhibiting suspicious behavior in the gate area including excessive phone use, nervous movements, and appearing to surveil other passengers. Additionally, multiple passengers reported feeling uncomfortable with your presence." "Feeling uncomfortable with my presence," Sarah repeated slowly, and she could hear the barely controlled anger in her own voice now. "Let me guess, these passengers who felt uncomfortable, they wouldn't happen to be a middle-aged white couple, would they? And my excessive phone use was actually me texting my sister to let her know what time I'd be landing. The nervous movements were me shifting my bag from one shoulder to the other because it's heavy. And surveilling passengers means I looked around the gate area like literally every person does when they're waiting to board a flight." Jennifer's face flushed red and she said sharply, "Your attitude right now is exactly why we need you off this aircraft. You're being confrontational and aggressive, which only confirms the concerns that were raised about you." Robert, the male flight attendant, finally spoke up saying, "Ma'am, if you would just cooperate and exit peacefully, we can sort all of this out in the terminal. Continuing to argue is only going to make this worse for everyone." Sarah looked at the three faces staring at her with various degrees of hostility, judgment, and impatience, and she realized with bitter clarity that nothing she said would change their minds. They had already decided she was a problem passenger who needed to be removed, and any attempt to defend herself would only be seen as further proof of her guilt. She thought about mentioning her background, about telling them exactly who she was and what she'd done in her career, but pride and dignity stopped her. She refused to beg or plead or wave her credentials around demanding special treatment. If they wanted her off their plane based on nothing more than racial profiling and the complaints of bigoted passengers, then she would leave with her head held high. "Fine," she said quietly. "I'll leave. But I want to be perfectly clear that this is discrimination, it's unjust, and I will be filing complaints with the airline, the FAA, and any other organization that oversees this kind of behavior." Jennifer's expression showed a flicker of concern at the mention of formal complaints, but she recovered quickly and said, "You're welcome to file whatever complaints you wish once we've completed the removal process. Please exit the aircraft now." Sarah turned and walked through the aircraft door without another word, stepping back into the jet bridge with the security officer following closely behind her. As she walked back up the jet bridge toward the terminal, she could hear the door closing behind her and the muffled sounds of the crew making announcements to the remaining passengers, probably explaining the delay as a minor security matter that had been resolved. The walk through the jet bridge felt surreal, like she was moving through a dream where nothing quite made sense, and by the time she emerged back into the terminal she felt emotionally exhausted despite the confrontation lasting less than 10 minutes. The security officer led her to a small office near the gate where he asked her to wait while he filed his report, which involved taking down her information and asking her to recount what had happened. Sarah answered his questions mechanically, providing her name, address, and contact information while explaining that she had done absolutely nothing wrong and had been removed based solely on discriminatory complaints. The officer didn't argue with her, but his expression suggested he'd heard similar stories many times before and had become numb to them. He told her that her ticket would be refunded and she could rebook on a later flight, though he couldn't promise she wouldn't face additional screening given the incident report that would now be in the airline system. Sarah just nodded, too tired to argue anymore, and when he finally told her she was free to go, she walked out of the office and collapsed into one of the hard plastic chairs near the gate. She pulled out her phone and saw that it was 3:47 in the afternoon, which meant 9 minutes had passed since she'd been escorted off the aircraft. Through the massive window she could see Flight 227 still sitting at the gate, the ground crew moving around beneath it performing their final checks before departure. She felt a confusing mixture of emotions washing over her as she watched her former flight preparing to leave without her. There was anger at the injustice of what had happened, embarrassment at being publicly removed and humiliated, frustration that her plans were now ruined, but underneath it all was a deeper sadness that came from knowing this kind of treatment was something she'd faced before in different forms throughout her life. She was a 42-year-old woman who had achieved things most people couldn't imagine, who had flown missions that would remain classified for decades, who had saved lives and served her country with distinction, and yet all of that meant nothing to passengers who saw her and decided she looked suspicious. Sarah Chen had joined the Navy at 18 with dreams of becoming a pilot, and through a combination of natural talent, relentless determination, and pure stubbornness she'd made it through flight school and earned her wings. She'd flown F/A-18 Super Hornets off aircraft carriers, executing combat missions and training exercises that required split-second decisions and nerves of steel. She'd been one of the first female pilots in her squadron and had faced discrimination and harassment that made today's incident seem minor in comparison, but she'd never let it stop her from proving herself in the cockpit. After 12 years of active duty she'd transitioned to being a test pilot at Naval Air Station Patuxent River, where she'd evaluated experimental aircraft and systems that pushed the boundaries of aviation technology. She'd logged over 4,000 flight hours in more than 70 different types of aircraft, from single-engine trainers to multi-engine transports to cutting-edge fighters. She'd experienced and recovered from engine failures, hydraulic problems, electrical fires, bird strikes, and weather emergencies that would have killed less experienced pilots. 3 years ago she'd retired from active duty and taken a position as a flight instructor and aviation safety consultant, using her decades of experience to teach the next generation of pilots and help airlines improve their emergency procedures. She gave lectures at aviation conferences, wrote articles for professional journals, and consulted with aircraft manufacturers on cockpit design and human factors. She'd been in Denver this week doing exactly that kind of work, conducting emergency training scenarios with pilots from a major cargo airline, putting them through simulated disasters to see how they responded under pressure. The irony of being removed from a commercial flight for looking suspicious wasn't lost on her, and she almost laughed at how absurd the whole situation was. But she didn't laugh, because it wasn't actually funny, it was just painful and exhausting and sadly predictable. She was staring out the window at Flight 227 when she saw the ground crew suddenly stop their work and start gesturing urgently toward the aircraft. A moment later the jet bridge extended again and connected back to the plane, which was unusual since the door had already been closed for departure. Sarah sat up straighter, her pilot instincts immediately noting that something was wrong with the normal departure sequence. Ground personnel were running now rather than walking, and she could see someone in an airline uniform rushing down the jet bridge toward the aircraft. Her phone suddenly rang with an unknown number and she answered it saying, "Hello." The voice on the other end was male, breathless, and filled with barely controlled panic as it said, "Is this Sarah Chen?" The passenger who was just removed from Flight 227 to San Francisco. "Yes, this is Sarah Chen," she said slowly, her heart rate beginning to increase as her brain started processing what an emergency call might mean. The voice said, "This is Captain Mike Reynolds, I'm the pilot of Flight 227 and we have a catastrophic emergency. Our first officer has collapsed and is unresponsive, and I'm experiencing severe chest pains and vision problems that I believe indicate a heart attack or stroke. I found your name in our passenger manifest when I was looking for anyone with aviation credentials who might be able to help us. Your military service record and pilot ratings are flagged in the FAA database. We desperately need you back on this aircraft immediately. I don't know how much time I have before I'm completely incapacitated, and if that happens before we can get another pilot here, everyone on this plane is going to die." Sarah was already moving before he finished speaking, her chair clattering backward as she jumped to her feet and started running toward the gate. "I'm coming right now," she said into the phone, her voice shifting into the calm, authoritative tone she'd used in countless emergencies. "How many people are on board and what's the status of your first officer?" Captain Reynolds' voice was getting weaker as he said, "We have 147 passengers and 5 crew members. First Officer Martinez collapsed about 2 minutes ago. We think it might be an aneurysm or cardiac event. I'm trying to keep it together but my left arm is going numb and the pain in my chest is getting worse. The flight attendants are panicking and the passengers don't know what's happening yet but they're going to figure it out very soon. Please hurry, we need you." Sarah reached the gate agent's desk where a young woman was staring at her computer screen with a confused expression, clearly trying to figure out what was happening with Flight 227. "I need to get back on that aircraft immediately," Sarah said, her voice brooking no argument. "This is an emergency, the pilots are both incapacitated and they need me to help fly the plane." The gate agent looked at her with wide eyes and said, "But you were just removed for security reasons, I can't just let you back on, I need authorization from my supervisor and," Sarah cut her off saying, "There is no time for authorization. There are 147 people on that plane who are going to die if I don't get in that cockpit right now. Open the jet bridge door or I will open it myself and you can explain to your supervisor why you prioritized paperwork over saving lives." The gate agent stared at her for one more second then seemed to realize the gravity of the situation and quickly typed something into her computer, and Sarah heard the door lock click open. She didn't wait for further permission, just pushed through the door and sprinted down the jet bridge faster than she'd run in years, her messenger bag bouncing against her side and her phone still clutched in one hand. She burst through the aircraft door into the forward galley where Jennifer and Robert were standing looking terrified, and past them she could see into the cockpit where Captain Reynolds was slumped in the left seat with one hand pressed against his chest and his face gray with pain. The first officer was completely unconscious in the right seat, his head lolled to one side and his breathing shallow. "I'm here," Sarah said, pushing past the stunned flight attendants and entering the cockpit. Captain Reynolds looked up at her with eyes that were filled with both relief and desperation and he said, "Thank God. I don't know how much longer I can stay conscious. Can you fly this aircraft?" Sarah slid into the jump seat behind the center console and quickly scanned the instrument panel, her brain automatically processing the configuration of the Boeing 737 and comparing it to her extensive knowledge of similar aircraft. "I can fly it," she said with absolute confidence. "I have over 4,000 hours in military and civilian aircraft including several hundred in 737 simulators during consulting work. Talk me through your current situation and what happened to both of you." Captain Reynolds tried to straighten up in his seat but winced in pain and said, "We were going through our pre-departure checks when Martinez just made a strange sound and collapsed. I called for medical assistance but before anyone could respond I started having chest pains. It's getting worse by the second and I'm having trouble focusing my vision. I think we might have been exposed to something, maybe carbon monoxide or some other contaminant in the air system, but I don't know for sure. The aircraft systems all show normal and I can't find any indication of what might have caused both of us to have simultaneous medical emergencies." Sarah leaned forward and looked at the environmental controls, noting that the air conditioning packs were running normally and the cabin pressure was stable. She said, "Could be a chemical exposure or it could just be a terrible coincidence. Either way, we need to get both of you medical attention immediately and I need to take control of this aircraft." Captain Reynolds nodded weakly and said, "The aircraft is configured for departure, we're fueled and ready to go, but obviously we can't take off with passengers on board and no qualified crew. We need to get everyone off the plane and wait for replacement pilots." Sarah shook her head and said, "That's going to take hours and you need medical attention right now, not in 2 hours after we evacuate and get replacement crew here. I'm going to do something unconventional. I'm going to call Tower and declare an emergency, then I'm going to taxi this aircraft to a remote location where emergency services can meet us and get both of you to a hospital immediately. The aircraft is airworthy, the engines are running, and I can safely taxi it to wherever they need us to go. It's faster than waiting for ambulances to navigate airport traffic to get to the gate." Captain Reynolds started to protest but another wave of pain hit him and he gasped, and Sarah saw his hands start to shake on the control yoke. She made her decision in that instant and reached forward to key the radio, saying, "Denver Tower, this is Flight 227 at Gate B17 declaring an emergency. Both pilots are incapacitated due to medical emergencies and I am a military-trained pilot preparing to take command of the aircraft. I need immediate medical response and instructions for taxiing to the nearest location where we can meet emergency services." The tower controller's voice came back instantly, professional but urgent, saying, "Flight 227, tower copies your emergency. Can you confirm your qualifications and current situation?" Sarah rattled off her credentials in the efficient shorthand that pilots used, giving her Navy service record, her flight hours, her ratings, and her current position as a safety consultant and instructor. She explained that both the captain and first officer were incapacitated with what appeared to be cardiac or neurological emergencies and that she needed to move the aircraft immediately to get them help. The tower controller conferred with someone in the background and then came back saying, "Flight 227, we're clearing all traffic from your area. We need you to start engines and taxi to the South Service Road where emergency vehicles are already being dispatched. Can you handle that taxi in an unfamiliar aircraft?" Sarah looked at the engine instruments and saw that both engines were already running from the pre-departure sequence, and she said, "Tower, engines are already running and aircraft is ready to taxi. I'm familiar with 737 operations and I can safely move this aircraft. What's my routing?" As the controller gave her taxi instructions, Sarah was already making calculations about weight, balance, and the turning radius she'd need to navigate away from the gate. She turned to Jennifer who was standing in the cockpit doorway looking absolutely terrified and said, "I need you to listen very carefully. I am taking control of this aircraft to get the captain and first officer to emergency medical care. We are not taking off, we are only taxiing to a different location on the airport. I need you to make an announcement to the passengers explaining that we've had a medical emergency with the pilots and that a qualified pilot is now in command. Tell them to remain calm and seated with their seatbelts fastened. Do not tell them I was removed from the plane 30 minutes ago, that will only cause panic. Can you do that?" Jennifer nodded mutely, still in shock, and stumbled back toward the PA system. Sarah turned her attention back to the cockpit and said to Captain Reynolds, "I need you to release the parking brake and give me any information about aircraft weight and balance that I need to know." Reynolds fumbled with the brake handle and managed to release it, then said in a voice that was barely a whisper, "Aircraft is showing gross weight of 138,000 pounds, center of gravity is within limits, fuel is 11,000 pounds. All systems showing normal except for the cabin air quality sensor which went offline about 5 minutes before Martinez collapsed." That last piece of information sent alarm bells ringing in Sarah's head and she quickly reached up to switch the air conditioning packs to high flow and opened the outflow valves wider to increase the air exchange rate in the cabin. If there was a contamination issue they needed fresh air flowing through the system as quickly as possible. She heard Jennifer's shaky voice come over the PA system saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your lead flight attendant with an important announcement. We've experienced a medical emergency with our flight crew and a highly qualified pilot is now in command of the aircraft. We will be taxiing to a different location to get medical attention for our crew members. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened and follow all instructions from the crew. There is no danger to the aircraft or passengers." Sarah could hear confused and alarmed voices from the cabin but she didn't have time to worry about passenger reactions right now. She was already advancing the throttles slightly and feeling the massive aircraft begin to roll away from the gate, the jet bridge separating and retracting automatically as they moved. The sensation of controlling such a large aircraft from the jump seat rather than the pilot's position was awkward but not impossible, and Sarah's years of experience in tight cockpits and unusual seating positions helped her adapt quickly. She kept the taxi speed slow and careful, following the yellow lines painted on the taxiway while monitoring the wing clearance from other aircraft and ground equipment. The tower controller was giving her updates on the position of emergency vehicles and keeping all other traffic well clear of her path. She could see fire trucks and ambulances already racing across the airfield toward the service road where she'd been directed to take the aircraft. Behind her she could hear Captain Reynolds' labored breathing getting worse, and she called back to the flight attendant saying, "I need medical personnel up here immediately if there are any doctors or nurses on board." A woman's voice called from the cabin, "I'm a trauma nurse," and moments later a tall woman in her 30s pushed into the cockpit and immediately moved to Captain Reynolds' side. She took one look at him and said, "He's having a major cardiac event, possibly a heart attack. I need to get him out of that seat and start treatment." Sarah shook her head without taking her eyes off the taxiway and said, "I can't have him moved until we get stopped at the emergency vehicles. We're in motion and moving him now could be dangerous for everyone. Do what you can for him while he's in the seat, but he needs to stay strapped in for another 3 minutes." The nurse didn't argue, just started checking Reynolds' pulse and pupils while talking to him in a calm, professional voice trying to keep him conscious. Sarah navigated the aircraft around a corner and onto the service road where she could see a cluster of emergency vehicles with lights flashing waiting ahead. She keyed the radio and said, "Tower, Flight 227 has visual on emergency vehicles and I'm bringing the aircraft to a stop now." She pulled back the throttles to idle and let the aircraft's momentum bleed off, then applied the brakes gently and smoothly, bringing the massive machine to a complete stop about 50 feet from the waiting ambulances and fire trucks. The moment the aircraft was stopped she set the parking brake and said to the nurse, "Get him out now, get them both to the hospital as fast as possible." EMTs were already rushing toward the aircraft with stretchers and medical equipment, and Sarah opened the cockpit door to let them in. The next several minutes were controlled chaos as emergency personnel flooded into the cockpit and worked to stabilize both Captain Reynolds and First Officer Martinez before carefully extracting them from their seats and getting them onto stretchers. Sarah stayed in the jump seat coordinating with tower and company operations, explaining what had happened and providing information about the possible air quality issue that might have caused the pilot's simultaneous collapse. She recommended that the aircraft be taken out of service immediately for a full inspection of the environmental systems before it carried passengers again. The EMTs got both pilots loaded into ambulances which screamed away toward the hospital with sirens wailing, and suddenly the cockpit was quiet again with just Sarah sitting there surrounded by the blinking lights and displays of the aircraft's instrument panel. A man in an airline captain's uniform appeared in the cockpit doorway and said, "I'm Captain Anderson, I'm a check airman for the airline and I was deadheading in the terminal when they called for any available pilots. I've been briefed on what happened and I have to say what you did was remarkable. Thank you for stepping in." Sarah nodded tiredly and said, "I just did what needed to be done." "How are the passengers?" Anderson said, "Shaken up but okay. We're going to tow the aircraft back to the gate and deplane everyone, then get them rebooked on other flights. The airline's safety team wants to interview you about what happened and I think there are going to be some very uncomfortable conversations with certain people about how you were treated earlier." Sarah felt a grim satisfaction at that, but she was too exhausted to really enjoy it. She climbed out of the jump seat and made her way back into the cabin where passengers were gathered in small groups talking in urgent, shocked voices about what had just happened. She saw Jennifer standing near the forward galley looking absolutely devastated, her earlier confidence and hostility completely gone. When Jennifer saw Sarah she started to say something but Sarah just walked past her without a word, not trusting herself to have that conversation right now when her emotions were still running so high. She made her way to her original seat in row 23 and found her messenger bag still sitting in the overhead bin where she'd left it 90 minutes ago, which felt like a lifetime ago now. As she pulled down her bag she became aware that the passengers around her were staring, and one man in the seat next to where hers had been said, "You're the pilot who just saved everyone, aren't you? The one who was removed from the plane earlier." Sarah looked at him and saw recognition and shame in his expression, and she realized he must have been one of the passengers who witnessed her removal. She said quietly, "Yes, I'm that pilot." The man shook his head and said, "I thought you were dangerous. When they took you off the plane I assumed they had a good reason. I'm so sorry. If you hadn't been here, if you'd already left the airport, we'd all be dead right now, wouldn't we?" Sarah considered several different responses she could give, ranging from gracious to cutting, and finally settled on simple honesty saying, "Yes, probably. Emergency response times for getting replacement pilots here would have been at least 90 minutes, and Captain Reynolds didn't have 90 minutes. Sometimes snap judgments and prejudice have real consequences. She walked toward the front of the aircraft where airport security personnel were waiting to escort passengers off once the aircraft was towed back to the gate. As she passed the middle-aged couple who had complained about her, the woman grabbed her arm and said, "Wait, I didn't realize, we didn't know you were a pilot, we thought." Sarah gently removed the woman's hand from her arm and said, "You thought what, exactly? That I looked suspicious because I'm Asian? That using my phone and looking around made me a threat? You didn't know anything about me but you made assumptions and demanded I be removed, and those assumptions nearly killed everyone on this plane including yourselves. I hope you'll think about that the next time you decide someone looks suspicious." The woman's face crumpled and her husband looked like he wanted to disappear, but Sarah didn't wait for their response. She found herself being directed to a private area of the terminal where airline executives and FAA investigators were already gathering to begin the process of documenting what had happened. Over the next 3 hours she gave multiple interviews describing every detail of the emergency from the moment she received Captain Reynolds' phone call until the EMTs took over in the cockpit. She explained her background and qualifications, provided her theory about possible environmental contamination based on the air quality sensor failure, and answered hundreds of technical questions about her decision-making process and her handling of the aircraft. The airline's chief pilot, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, sat through most of the interviews, and when they finally concluded he asked to speak with her privately. "Ms. Chen," he said once they were alone in a small conference room, "I don't have adequate words to express my gratitude for what you did today, or my horror and shame at how you were treated by our crew. I've already reviewed the security footage and interviewed the flight attendants involved, and I can tell you that disciplinary action is being taken. The passengers who made the initial complaint have been banned from flying with our airline. This should never have happened and I am personally apologizing to you on behalf of everyone at this company." Sarah looked at him steadily and said, "Your apology is noted, but what I really want to know is what's going to change. How many other qualified passengers have been removed from flights because they looked suspicious to someone? How many emergencies have there been where expertise was available but nobody thought to check because they'd already judged someone as a threat?" The chief pilot had no good answer to that and his silence spoke volumes. After a moment he said, "We're going to implement new training protocols for our crews about bias and profiling, and we're creating a database system that will flag passengers with relevant expertise in emergencies. I know that doesn't undo what happened to you, but I hope it will prevent similar situations in the future." Sarah nodded slowly and said, "I hope so too. And I hope Captain Reynolds and First Officer Martinez make full recoveries. Have you heard anything about their conditions?" The chief pilot said, "Last update I got was that Reynolds is in surgery for a blocked coronary artery and Martinez is in ICU with a suspected brain hemorrhage. Both are critical but stable. The doctors said if they'd arrived even 30 minutes later, the outcomes would have been very different. You saved their lives along with everyone else on that aircraft." Sarah finally allowed herself to feel the weight of what had happened, the enormousness of how close 147 people had come to dying, and how a series of poor decisions and prejudiced judgments had nearly prevented their rescue. She thought about all the times in her career when she'd faced discrimination and overcome it, all the times she'd had to prove herself twice as much as her male colleagues, all the times someone had looked at her and made assumptions about her capabilities based on her gender or her ethnicity. Today those assumptions had nearly killed more than 100 people, and the only reason they hadn't was because she refused to let anger or hurt pride stop her from doing what needed to be done. The airline provided her with a hotel room for the night and a first-class ticket on a flight the next morning, along with an offer of financial compensation that she told them she'd consider after consulting with a lawyer. She spent the evening in her hotel room watching news coverage of the incident, which had already spread across social media and news outlets. The story was being framed as a dramatic rescue by a heroic pilot, with most reports focusing on her military background and her quick action during the emergency. Some reports were beginning to mention that she'd been removed from the flight earlier, though the full details of that incident were still emerging. She saw herself described as courageous, skilled, professional, and remarkably calm under pressure, and she thought about how none of those qualities had mattered to the flight attendant who looked at her and decided she was a problem. Her phone rang constantly with calls from news organizations requesting interviews, from aviation colleagues congratulating her, from family members who'd seen the news and wanted to make sure she was okay. She answered her sister's call and spent 20 minutes reassuring her that she was fine and explaining what had really happened, including the discrimination she'd faced. Her sister was furious on her behalf and wanted her to sue everyone involved, but Sarah was too tired to think about lawsuits right now. She just wanted to process everything that had happened and try to make sense of a day that had started with her being humiliated and ended with her saving more than 100 lives. The next morning she flew home to San Francisco without incident, noting the irony that she was now being treated like royalty by the airline staff who recognized her from the news coverage. The flight crew thanked her multiple times for her service, other passengers asked to take photos with her, and the captain invited her to visit the cockpit before takeoff where he showed her the message that had been sent to all crews about the incident. It described her actions as exemplary and included new protocols for identifying passengers with relevant expertise during emergencies. Sarah accepted the thanks graciously but found the whole experience somewhat surreal after being treated as a threat less than 24 hours earlier. When she finally arrived home she collapsed on her couch and allowed herself to feel all the emotions she'd been holding back for the past day. She cried for the first time since the incident, not from sadness but from sheer emotional exhaustion and relief that everyone had survived. She thought about Captain Reynolds and First Officer Martinez fighting for their lives in a hospital, about the passengers who had gone home to their families never knowing how close they'd come to disaster, about the flight attendants who would have to live with the knowledge that their actions nearly prevented a rescue. She thought about the couple who'd complained about her and wondered if they truly understood the consequences of their prejudice, or if they'd just moved on to their next flight and their next set of assumptions about who looked dangerous. Over the following weeks she learned that Captain Reynolds had survived his surgery and was recovering well, though he'd be on medical leave for several months. First Officer Martinez had also survived but faced a longer recovery from his brain hemorrhage with an uncertain prognosis about whether he'd be able to fly again. The FAA's investigation determined that both pilots had suffered simultaneous medical emergencies that were most likely coincidental rather than caused by environmental factors, though the aircraft underwent extensive testing anyway. The flight attendant who'd removed her from the plane was suspended pending additional training, and the couple who'd made the initial complaint were quietly dealing with the public backlash from social media users who'd identified them and weren't sympathetic to their explanations. Sarah received hundreds of messages from other people who'd faced similar discrimination while traveling, sharing their own stories of being profiled, questioned, or removed from flights because someone decided they looked suspicious. She heard from Asian Americans, Muslims, Black travelers, Latino passengers, and countless others who'd experienced the humiliation of being singled out based on nothing more than their appearance. Many of them thanked her for speaking openly about what had happened to her and for not quietly accepting the discrimination. Some expressed satisfaction that her expertise had been so dramatically proven necessary, while others worried that it shouldn't take saving a plane full of people for someone's qualifications to be recognized and their dignity respected. The incident sparked broader conversations about bias in airline security, about the balance between safety and discrimination, about how crew members were trained to identify genuine threats versus their own prejudices. Aviation organizations invited Sarah to speak at conferences about both the technical aspects of her emergency response and the social issues surrounding her removal from the flight. She found herself becoming an advocate for fair treatment of passengers while also educating people about emergency procedures and the importance of having a diverse pool of qualified individuals who might be called upon in crisis situations. She talked about how discrimination doesn't just hurt individuals, it potentially puts everyone at risk by removing qualified people from situations where they might be needed. Several months after the incident she received a letter from Jennifer, the flight attendant who'd removed her from the plane. The letter was several pages long and clearly written after much soul-searching and reflection. Jennifer apologized profusely for her actions, explaining that she'd been trained to trust passenger complaints and had made assumptions based on the couple's insistence that Sarah was behaving suspiciously. She wrote about the guilt she felt knowing that her decision nearly prevented Sarah from being available when she was desperately needed, and about the training she'd undergone since the incident to recognize and combat her own biases. She asked for forgiveness while acknowledging that she had no right to expect it, and she enclosed a donation receipt showing she'd contributed to an organization fighting discrimination in travel. Sarah read the letter twice and then filed it away, not ready to forgive but appreciating the acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The story of Flight 227 became something of a legend in aviation circles, studied in training programs and discussed in safety briefings as an example of both crisis management and the dangers of prejudiced decision-making. Sarah found herself cited in academic papers about emergency response, diversity in aviation, and the psychology of discrimination. Young pilots wrote to her saying she'd inspired them to pursue aviation careers despite facing their own challenges and prejudice. Parents told her their children had written school reports about her, holding her up as an example of grace under pressure and dignity in the face of injustice. She was simultaneously uncomfortable with the attention and grateful that some good was coming from such a painful experience. What stayed with her most powerfully wasn't the dramatic rescue or the recognition that followed, but rather the 9 minutes she'd spent sitting in the terminal watching her flight prepare for departure while feeling humiliated and angry about her unjust removal. Those 9 minutes represented every time she'd been dismissed, underestimated, or judged based on her appearance rather than her capabilities. They represented every person who'd ever been made to feel like they didn't belong, like they were suspicious or dangerous simply for existing in a space where others didn't expect to see them. And they represented the terrible randomness of how close catastrophe had been, how easily those 147 people could have died simply because prejudice had removed the one person who could save them. She thought often about the alternate timeline where Captain Reynolds' medical emergency had occurred just 15 minutes later, after she'd already left the terminal to find another way home. In that timeline there would have been no qualified pilot immediately available, emergency services would have scrambled to find replacement crew, and precious minutes would have ticked away while Reynolds and Martinez lost consciousness with no one qualified to take control. In that timeline the story would have had a very different ending, one that would have been studied as a tragedy of timing and missed opportunities rather than a miracle of coincidence and expertise. The fact that such disaster had been averted by the narrowest of margins, by nothing more than her decision to remain in the terminal despite her humiliation, made her realize how fragile the line was between catastrophe and salvation. Sarah continued her work as a flight instructor and safety consultant, but the incident changed how she approached her teaching. She spent more time discussing human factors and decision-making, talking with her students about how their own biases and assumptions could affect their judgment in critical moments. She emphasized the importance of gathering complete information before making decisions, of questioning their first impressions, of recognizing that expertise and capability came in forms they might not expect. She told them the story of Flight 227 not to glorify her own actions but to illustrate how easily qualified help could be dismissed or overlooked, and how critical it was to keep an open mind about who might be able to assist in an emergency. Years later, when people asked her about that day, Sarah would say that the most important lesson wasn't about her piloting skills or emergency training, it was about the cost of prejudice and the value of giving people dignity even when you don't understand their worth. She'd learned through hard experience that you never knew when the person you dismissed might be exactly the person you needed, when the passenger you removed might be the pilot who could save your life. She'd learned that assumptions based on appearance were not just morally wrong but potentially deadly, and that true safety came from inclusion and recognition of diverse capabilities rather than exclusion based on fear. The incident also reinforced for her what she'd always known about herself, that her identity as a pilot wasn't something she wore on her sleeve or used to demand special treatment, but rather something intrinsic to who she was and how she moved through the world. She'd refused to mention her credentials when being removed from the plane not because she was passive or accepting of discrimination, but because she believed her worth as a human being shouldn't depend on her professional achievements. The fact that those achievements had proven essential to saving lives was almost beside the point. She would have been equally deserving of dignity and fair treatment if she'd been a teacher, a nurse, an engineer, or someone with no specialized skills at all. The prejudice she'd faced was wrong regardless of whether it ended up being practically dangerous, though the dramatic nature of the consequences had certainly driven that lesson home. Flight 227 landed safely in San Francisco the next day after replacement pilots were brought in, carrying passengers who would forever remember the emergency that nearly killed them and the unexpected hero who'd been removed from their flight only to return and save them all. The middle-aged couple who'd complained about Sarah issued a public apology that was widely mocked as insufficient and self-serving. Captain Reynolds returned to flying after his recovery and made a point of meeting Sarah in person to thank her for saving his life and the lives of everyone aboard his aircraft. First Officer Martinez's recovery was longer and more difficult, but he eventually returned to limited flying duties and sent Sarah a heartfelt letter describing her as the reason he was still alive to see his children grow up. The airline instituted sweeping changes to their crew training programs, their passenger complaint protocols, and their emergency response procedures, directly citing the Flight 227 incident as the catalyst for reform. Other airlines followed suit, recognizing that their own policies and training might harbor similar vulnerabilities. Aviation authorities worldwide studied the incident and incorporated lessons from it into their safety recommendations and regulatory requirements. Sarah's name became permanently associated with discussions about both emergency preparedness and discrimination in travel, a legacy she carried with mixed feelings but ultimate pride. On the anniversary of the incident, Sarah returned to Denver International Airport and stood at the window near Gate B-17, looking out at the aircraft parked there and remembering the worst and best moments of that impossible day. She thought about how close everything had come to ending in tragedy, about how many small decisions and circumstances had aligned to put her in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment to make a difference. She thought about the flight attendant who'd ordered her to leave immediately, about the 9 minutes that had passed before the emergency began, about the desperate phone call that had sent her running back down the jet bridge to save lives. And she thought about all the times in her career and in her life when someone had looked at her and seen a threat rather than a potential ally, a problem rather than a solution, someone to be excluded rather than someone who might be essential. The story of Flight 227 would be told and retold in aviation schools, safety seminars, diversity training programs, and casual conversations among pilots for decades to come, but for Sarah it remained intensely personal. It was the day when prejudice and professionalism collided, when discrimination nearly caused disaster, when expertise hidden beneath an ordinary appearance saved more than 100 lives. It was the day she proved that you should never judge someone's capabilities by their appearance, and that the person you dismiss might be exactly the person you need. It was the day 9 minutes made the difference between tragedy and triumph, and when a flight attendant's order to leave immediately became the setup for a desperate call to come back and save them all. Most of all, it was a reminder that dignity, expertise, and worth are not always visible on the surface, and that treating everyone with respect is not just a moral imperative but sometimes a practical necessity for survival itself.